Hello, and thank you for joining this interview. My name's Tom Hughes. I'm the Strategic Markets Editor for Biofuels and Feedstocks here at Fastmarkets in London, a price reporting agency covering the metals, forestry, and agriculture industries. I was fortunate enough to have this interview with Patrick Lynch from the software company Bioledger that focuses on software solutions for traceability and sustainability within the biofuels supply chain, including within the heavily legislated EU market. And I was fortunate enough to have this interview with him on the eve of the 21st of May deadline for the implementation of the third iteration of the Renewable Energy Directive into the domestic laws of each of the 27 member states. And we've since heard that, according to some agencies, this deadline is now not binding, and we're waiting for an update from the EU and member states on a new date. But as it stands still, and as it stood before the interview, this was a critical deadline. And yeah, it's I'm happy to have this interview. And Patrick, thank you for being here. Thanks.
Thank you, Tom. It's great to be given the opportunity to talk through some of these issues. I think it's a it's a very complex topic that people have not maybe had the opportunity to talk through, and it's been under discussion for more than 5 years now. So some people will be suffering from fatigue in talking about this subject. So it's nice to come to a deadline and try and take stock of where we are and the next steps to make it successful. So thank you again for the opportunity. My name is Patrick Lynch. I'm the founder of Bioledger. We're a company based in the UK. We have colleagues across UK, Ireland, Spain, and Poland. And yeah, we build software that helps companies demonstrate compliance with the traceability and sustainability requirements set out in the Renewable Energy Directive and the voluntary schemes that help them do that. We've also built modules to help companies demonstrate compliance with the requirements in the US market, the EPA Renewable Fuel Standard. And we're a nominated and connected access point provider to the union database. So where companies use our software to help them manage mass balance compliance and digitize their transactions through the supply chain. Through our access point, we can also synchronize those transactions into the union database. And we've been working with the European Commission and all of the other stakeholders over the last 5 years to try and design the union database to become a tool that helps auditors, companies, and regulators in the biofuel supply chain um, regain trust in traceability throughout the global biofuel supply chain. So it's an extremely complicated objective and a very diverse set of challenges. And we've had um, a lot of success and we still face a lot of challenges. So it is, again, nice to speak through those challenges with you today.
Great. No, thank you, Patrick. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here with you, and it's really great. I think that, our listeners and people in the biofuels market and beyond will be really interested in a lot of the themes here because I can speak, from my own experience as a journalist covering these markets for the past few years, that compared to a lot of physical commodity markets, I don't think I've ever encountered one that really is so governed really by legislation. And certainly in the EU, legislation is really key to these markets. And very often, market developments, even market pricing, can be very heavily influenced by EU policy, or in some cases, a lack of clarity on EU policy and developments of various EU operations and investigations. Most recent one of the recent things that springs to mind was the case back in 2023 when the EU launched an investigation into biodiesel and feedstocks from Asia, two investigations, in fact. But I suppose, given that we're, a day ahead of this deadline, and the EU, the third iteration of the EU Renewable Energy Directive is quite ambitious. Includes a more than doubling of the share of renewables in energy in transportation, in road transportation, to around about an aim of around about a 29% share by 2030. It's pretty ambitious compared to the second iteration. I mean, are there any cases, Patrick, that you're aware of some member states that maybe have struggled to reach this 21st of May deadline and transpose certain things into their domestic laws? And any sort of specific areas or cases that you've encountered in recent months?
Yeah, the description of the Red Three as another iteration of the policy is very appropriate. I think from I've been working in the biofuel supply chain since 2009 when the first directive was being defined, and worked in the supply chain since then. And I would say those iterations have needed to be developed because the supply chain or the policy objectives have always been to decarbonize energy in Europe and transport specifically. But when they were originally defined, we I think the policies assumed that sustainability uh, uh, they assumed sustainability in general, but as the scale of the supply chain grew to be a $100 billion industry that involves maybe 10 or 15,000 different companies in maybe 180 countries in the world, a huge range of dynamic sustainability risks became apparent as different member states implemented different policy incentives for different feedstock and biofuel pathways. And so when those risks become apparent, the iterations of the policy needed to specifically address those risks. And the Renewable Energy Directive Part 3 has been upgraded, especially to strengthen against um, the fraudulent disruptive cases that we've seen in the supply chain throughout the lifetime of the RED, but especially in the last 5 years, where there have been majorly disruptive events that are significant in scale, that needed to be addressed. And in terms of how the Red Three controls them, yeah, we I remember back in 2019 when I think this was the reason why I set up Bioledger in the beginning. There was a hugely disruptive fraud case based in the Netherlands that demonstrated that the current system of Excel and paper-based traceability around the globe was no longer fit for purpose to manage that scale and complexity. And so um, we set up the concept of digitizing the supply chain and implementing the union database. And
And I
the
think it'll be good, it'll be useful because I think one area that has been of interest has been the union database, and we saw this announced by the EU, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong here, Patrick, but as part of the second version of the Renewable Energy Directive. And it became functional, as I understand it, in January of 2024. But now, if I'm right in thinking it must be used, it must be used under the third iteration. And also, in terms of for our listeners, would you be able to explain roughly what the UDB is, the EU Union database is, and why it's necessary?
Yeah, so the concept of digitizing the transactions through the supply chain is old. It's older than Red 2. There were voluntary initiatives like one proposed by EBB back in the day. The BC system will be familiar to all of the listeners on the podcast. It's a German and Austrian specific database that tracks or it digitizes all transactions from the point of biofuel production until consumption and replaces the requirement for paper-based sustainability claims. The Union database is intended to expand that capability to all feedstock and fuel pathways from the point of origin of the feedstock until consumption and for a global scale. So it will give the European Commission and the member states the ability to observe all transactions within the EU RED certified supply chain, whether those transactions start as used cooking oil collections in China or as rapeseed produced in Germany. It will give the biofuel regulators a centralized database that they can monitor in real time and use that to then investigate implausible transactions that might be indicative of fraud, and they can then identify specifically where the fraud is happening or might be happening and use that to target surveillance audits in the supply chain exercised through the scope of the voluntary schemes and the member state authorities. And um, yeah, it's a powerful tool if it's used in the right way, and it gives people the protections that they need on data confidentiality and security. And uh, yeah,
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And my understanding is that, the ISCC, the key voluntary system used for traceability and sustainability, they launched a series of new documents, including the mandatory need for UDB transactions. I mean, as you mentioned just there, it's a powerful tool when used correctly. I guess, you highlight probably that there are maybe some problems with using the database. And I suppose, how can sort of Bioledger's tools benefit people or help people with those particular problems? And what might some of those problems be that as you understand them?
okay, yeah. So the Union database is a database built and controlled and monitored by the European Commission. The rules that define how it works and how it's used were written into the second RED and explained in more detail in the third, and also explained in extensive detail in the implementing regulation 996 in 2022. And that made it mandatory for the voluntary schemes to define audit checklists, so detailed audit checklists that could be used by certification bodies to ensure that companies were recording all transactions into the union database. The deadline for those checklists to be applied was when the UDB becomes operational, so a fairly subjective deadline. That was then also written into all of the voluntary schemes that were submitted for reapproval by the European Commission. So if a voluntary scheme wants to be a voluntary scheme, then the rules and criteria need to be assessed and approved by the Commission. All of the voluntary schemes were required to include union database transactions in order to be approved as voluntary schemes for RED 3. They did that, and now from 21st of May, tomorrow, all of the auditors who perform audits of companies anywhere in the world are required to check that the companies comply with these most recent updates of the Renewable Energy Directive, which include, it's not just the union database, but there are stricter controls on training and accreditation of auditors, the frequency of audits, the classification of non-conformances and the sanctions that apply from those non-conformances. And all of those rules are written into the system documents that are approved by the Commission for each of the voluntary schemes, including ISEC. And ISEC and other voluntary schemes users will have been informed of the update to those new audit checklists that apply from 21st of May. So the UDB is a mandatory requirement now to improve traceability as part of the voluntary schemes, but the member states also have a role in policing the UDB and enforcing its use. And the the RD3 requires the union database requires the member states to implement all components, including UDB use, into national legislation from tomorrow. And as you said on the call, the member states are at different stages of implementing RED 3 into national legislation. So whether or not these requirements become immediately binding depends on which country you're in. And well, the Czech Republic was one of the first, sorry, Czechia was one of the first countries to implement RED 3, including the union database requirements. But they still have difficulty in enforcing union database requirements because um, a lot of the supply chain operators are not fully ready to demonstrate compliance. So the industry does have some, well, it has huge uncertainty as to whether these requirements are mandatory tomorrow or not on the 21st of May.
And it is an issue. It is an issue, I think. The supply chain for biofuels is very complicated, and there is this great system that's been put forward, as we've highlighted here, as you've highlighted in great detail. Thank you, to track things at every point of the supply chain. But there have been recent stories in the last 2 years for sure, but certainly even in this year. Most recently, in late March, there was news that the EU was considering revoking ISCC accreditation for a certain period of time at the EU level, and ostensibly potentially leaving it up to the member states themselves to decide whether to accept ISCC certification of biofuels and feedstocks. That no doubt had caused some problems and showed the discrepancy really between the EU and the member states as well. And then also we had an issue recently in Germany under the country's own NABISI system, orchestrated by the Federal Office for Agriculture and Food, BLE, whereby some proof of sustainability certificates. So, for the benefit of our listeners, biofuels and feedstocks tend to carry with them, well, need to carry with them under the terms of RED, documentation called a POS, proof of sustainability document, effectively verifying the feedstock that they're linked to, if it's a biofuel, and verifying the feedstock in the case of a feedstock. And our understanding on the case in Germany recently was that an account in the country's system was frozen as authorities carried out an investigation. The outcome of that investigation was that the entity linked to the account and that was potentially supplying HVO, as we understood it, might not exist. However, the proof of sustainability documents linked to, as we understood it, that Fastmarkets volumes of HVO were still released into the market following this. I mean, I suppose, Patrick, it's difficult because both of us are outsiders to that case. But based on your own understanding, was there anything Germany could have done to stop those documents being released into the market? Because certainly the result of this was met with kind of consternation by the market. Why was this paperwork being released back into the market?
Yeah, I think that case in particular demonstrates the kind of systemic failure and the restrictions that the existing legislation apply to member states and how they can enforce and police compliance. So under the Renewable Energy Directive 3 or Article 30, if if the European Commission approves a voluntary scheme, then and a company uses that voluntary scheme as evidence to demonstrate compliance with the sustainability criteria in a member state market, the member state is not permitted to ask for additional evidence. And so the two things are related, the discussion about ISCC and the restriction on the BLE to be able to remove those POSs. So even though the BLE indicated that they were aware that a considerable amount of POSs were generated from a HVO producer that does not exist in real life, they had to honor the POSs generated by that invisible non-existent producer because they held ISCC certification at the time when the POSs were generated. And so I think how the German legislation is written, the BLE or the German ministry are only permitted to revoke POSs if they can demonstrate that there is intentional fraud. And if a producer doesn't exist, it's very difficult to demonstrate that there's intentional fraud because you cannot knock on a door and um, yeah, interrogate someone that doesn't exist. And so they've had to honor those POSs in the supply chain. And
That makes sense. Thank you so much for clarifying that, because, from my point of view as a reporter in this market for a number of years, covering various stories, and one of the memories for me that most notably comes to mind was um, when I was covering biodiesel in depth, the situation in China, in Europe, where we had large volumes at that time of biodiesel from China coming into the market. And some of that was alleged to have had questionable POS paperwork attached to it, and ostensibly a lot of that was going into the German market. There was a lot of this volume of biodiesel coming into Europe from China that was alleged to have had questionable POS certificates attached to it. Um, and that led to an extensive investigation. The investigation, as it was ongoing, also had the effect of effectively slowing down the market. And as people told me in the market, there was a lack of signposting in the market, both for where prices were going, but also really where more broadly where supply and demand was going. And I suppose based on that example and some of the other ones we've highlighted, I mean, are there any steps in your opinion that need to be taken in order to create a less opaque and better functioning system?
Yeah, definitely. So companies around the world are able to supply the European market with sustainable feedstocks and fuels on the basis that they demonstrate equally the same level of sustainability and traceability, and they can do that using the voluntary schemes and using independent accreditation bodies. And those independent accreditation bodies are approved by the voluntary schemes and accredited by government standardization institutes. They as private businesses, those companies have the freedom to apply for visas and go and perform audits in different places in the world. And the problem arose in 22, 23, and 24 when the European member states wanted to perform surveillance audits in third countries, but found that as government entities, they were not granted those visas. So they didn't have the ability to investigate. And so the only way to, or the most effective and fastest way to gain visibility on global supply chains is to digitize all of the transactions in the union database, and that's why the union database is recommended. It's mandated in legislation, but in any discussions, whether it was at the European Council or in stakeholder forums with the European Commission to try and address this problem about fraud, the one tool that the Commission has to be able to gain visibility in third country jurisdictions is the UDB, where companies in third countries by voluntary certification under European certification schemes, they will voluntarily enter their transactions in the UDB, and then the member states and the Commission can interrogate those transactions that way and immediately respond if they need to freeze an account or uh, hold hold some POSs, then they can immediately do that in the UDB.
Okay, well that's certainly interesting. I mean, one of the things that I've noticed as well, and I'm sure you have too, Patrick, in some of the systems that exist currently, most notably, there is sort of to a certain extent a little bit of a lack of transparency, really. So in systems such as Nabisi, many account holders remain nameless. Do you think that this will change under the UDB system? That the people inputting this information into it will be named? And also, do you think that third parties will be allowed access to that UDB system?
Yeah, the in order to have an account in the UDB, the account needs to be registered by the certification schemes, and the certification schemes are governed by the European Commission, so it is mandatory. And if anyone wants to generate a POS, their certification needs to be valid. So by that participation in a scheme, you will have a UDB account, including if you're in a third country. Um, and currently, everyone who has a valid voluntary scheme certificate already has a UDB account, and they've had the Commission made the UDB operational January 24. They communicated that testing the UDB through 2024 was a transitional year, and they welcomed feedback on new feature requests. And Bioledger worked with lots of companies in the supply chain to try and test those features and remove any barriers to adoption. The voluntary schemes and the European Commission performed a lot of training calls. And um, yeah, I would say now the challenge is more about uh, learning how the UDB works and for the stakeholders to have a clear deadline on when they need to receive their transactions via the UDB. Um, it's kind of a chicken and egg story where people know how the UDB works. They know that it's a mandatory requirement of voluntary scheme compliance from tomorrow, but they're dependent on their upstream supply chain to give them digital POSs in order for them to receive and process POSs and sell them further downstream into the European markets. So lacking that clear deadline is the main barrier actually today on full UDB implementation. But there are more than 30,000 transactions recorded in the UDB in the last couple of months, and all companies have an account. It's just everyone's waiting for the starter gun to go live.
Okay, so it could we could see a flurry of additional activity on this from tomorrow, but also by the same token, it sounds like as you describe it, and correct me if I'm wrong, this system has been well tested and it's working well. But I can't help but think that given the extent and the complexity of these supply chains, are there any issues still, do you feel, with policing it? Verifying that the digital POSs that are coming from, as you mentioned, upstream are valid. I think this goes back probably to the idea of audits and these schemes, voluntary schemes like ISCC carrying out good audits effectively.
Yeah, when you say working well, it's definitely working. And for the last say 16 months or so, there have been companies that have been able to record transactions from the very beginning of the supply chain until the end. So it does work. I wouldn't say that it works well. Um, there are some not technical issues, but operational issues where people would like to be able to perform transactions more efficiently. They have to receive a proof of sustainability and issue a POS, and for everyone in the market, that's an additional administrative requirement to record to create a new level of visibility in the supply chain. So while there are other systems like Nabizi and the normal POSs that are recorded on paper, uh, there is an extra effort required, and for different companies at different points of the supply chain, that effort is different. Oil majors have very large ERP systems, IT systems that they would like to integrate, whereas farmers don't want anything to do with recording transactions in an online register. And sorry, that's a generalization, but in my experience, and I am a farmer, I would say any extra admin is unwelcome. So there needs to be a lot of effort amongst the stakeholders to communicate the extra value of regaining trust in the supply chain and overcoming those efficiency barriers.
No, I think it's a very interesting point you raise about effectively you've got these different participants that are in the supply chain, and they all have different demands levied on them, and some of those demands are linked to the ways that they work, which are broadly quite different. Like you mentioned, an oil major is going to have a very different way of working than someone else further down the supply chain, whether that be a UCO collector or a farmer, and they're each going to have their different ways of working and ways of interacting with technology more broadly, of which this is part of. Um, no, this is really, really very, very interesting. I mean, I think, you know, I suppose, I suppose, as I kind of look at this market, part of the issue with road mandates in the EU and the way that RED 3 looks at the road fuel system is that effectively each member state has the ability to interpret the guidelines in RED 3 um, in the ways that they see fit, so long as they reach the minimum requirements outlined in RED 3. So a good example of this would be the difference between various member states having volumetric mandates, other member states having greenhouse gas saving mandates, and other member states even having energetic content systems. So measuring the percentage of the share of energy created by renewable fuels as part of the country's fuel network. Um, Do you think, when we look that, so that entails brings with it its own challenges as well. But have you heard anything specific with regard to some of the newer parts of the newer red legislation under Red 3, specifically the SAF mandate, which is generally applicable uniformly across the whole bloc, um, without member states adopting their own specifics? Is there anything that you've heard that's unique to sustainable aviation fuel or the supply chain there that you know of?
There are elements of SAF reporting under refuel that are specific to SAF, and there are modules within the UDB that enable a member state to account for the quantity of SAF blended onto flights in those countries. And yeah, airlines need to report, fuel suppliers need to report on SAF, and the member states need to report on SAF. And it's a hugely diverse range of fuel and feedstock pathways. And yeah, whether it's RFNBOs or gas supply chains, when you apply a digital reporting system in here, there are all these what appear small complexities in the design of the database, which are actually monumental barriers to trade when it comes to the supply chain. And an example being that all gas transactions need to be recorded through the UDB, but the UDB requires the transmission system operator to verify the quantities. And the Commission in the design phase has omitted to include that capability for non-European gas supply chains. So at the moment, if you're producing gas in Northern Ireland, for example, and trying to supply that to the Republic of Ireland market, the UDB does not allow you to sell that product or byproduct in the opposite direction. And so, yeah, there are really very technical details that need to be resolved. And I'd say the good thing is that the all of the stakeholders in this world of biofuels, feedstocks, compliance, and reporting, everyone has the same objective to help facilitate the quantity of sustainable, renewable, decarbonized transport fuel into the market. And um, there are very significant stakeholders working on resolving those problems. I think that the quantity of problems is the overwhelming part, and I'd say that
And it sounds like, the example you gave of the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, and it sounds like, certain participants in this market are getting more administrative burdens and hence, frankly, more costs than others in the market.
yeah, I think the UDB was designed in its early stages as being a very simple supply chain where feedstock was grown or collected as a waste and converted into liquid fuel and then consumed. I think over the last 5 years, the stakeholders have brought their unique problems and unique pathways to the European Commission UDB stakeholder workshops, communicated those, communicated the scale of the impacts, and the Commission have listened and added new features and added new uh, digital pathways to enable them to report. So the Commission are getting there, and I think that's why 2024 was a good transitional year to bring those problems to the table and have them resolved. At some point, the industry and the stakeholders need to weigh the value of not implementing the UDB and the delayed administrative burden with the value of implementing UDB and removing these market disruptions from the supply chain. Like you said, you observed the scale of the impact of alleged fraud from China in 2022, and many of the producer associations in Europe talked about closed biofuel plants, and today Greenergy, a plant where I used to work, had to close its doors for the first time since there was a flood in 2013. Um, and that's direct as a direct impact of a direct result of market distortions. And the industry does have to weigh the value of either performing this extra administrative burden of recording transactions digitally instead of on paper versus the benefit of removing fraud from the supply chain. And in 2019, when I set up Bioledger, my main driver was that the current voluntary scheme systems were manipulated by bad actors in the supply chain, and the Dutch regulators found that in one case, 32% of the volume of biofuel supplied into the Netherlands was delivered as fake POSs. So, and if it was a big story, it was a big motivator to try and fix the problem. And I'd say that the tragedy is that we've seen examples that are as blatant as that and as disruptive as that, maybe every 6 months, if not more frequently. And most recently, uh, like the estimations on of POSs generated by that non-existent HVO plant are equivalent to maybe 200 million euros worth of biofuel POSs that were generated without any viable production, and that's 200 million euros of sustainability premiums that did not go to collectors of wastes or didn't go to incentivize people to go into sewers and recover fats, oils, and greases or invent a new pathway to refine biogas into a liquid
One
fuel.
one other area, Patrick, that's always interested me. I've covered a number of um, physical commodity markets within the metals space, within agriculture, and within energy. And I understand there are unique challenges with regard biofuels, the range of feedstocks, etc. But it seems that there's less assaying of products, less testing of products that goes on in this market. And I appreciate that in some cases it's difficult to test biodiesel or even especially likely HVO because of various processes that are done during the production of that to test that to determine that the feedstock is definitively palm oil mill effluent or used cooking oil. Are there ways to do this in some cases? And has this been ever something that you've heard spoken about?
Yeah, definitely. Physical analysis is common practice. It's a more or less a mandatory requirement to sell either feedstock or fuel to anyone in the market. So it is done, and um, it's actually one of the new requirements that's included in some of the updates in the Red 3 standards that go live and mandatory tomorrow, where auditors are supposed to take consideration of lab reports that indicate whether a material is as described. So it's one of the strengthened requirements, and a lot of these RED3 updates are things that the industry asked for in 2019 after that biodiesel campaign event. Things like, yeah, that an auditor needs to verify the physical qualities of a product, and if they have any doubt, they can contact the lab essentially to corroborate the description.
Well, that's certainly a very interesting development there. Well, look, Patrick, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you. Many thanks for joining us here on really what is effectively quite a complicated, well, a very complicated topic, and one that is somewhat unique in some cases to the biofuels markets, especially in Europe. So really, thank you very much. And that's pretty much all we've got time for here. Patrick, thank you very much. Really appreciate you being here.
My pleasure, Tom. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. Thanks. And thank you also to our listeners for joining in and listening to this interview. Thank you both. And thank you all. Thanks.